Hi, I'm Bruce Jentelson, Director of the Terry Sanford Institute of Public Policy here at Duke University and a Professor of Public Policy and Political Science. And I'm here today with our special guest, Ambassador Princeton Lyman. Ambassador Lyman is paying a visit to the campus today in his current role as Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Global Interdependence Initiative. We've had a fascinating day of discussions on a range of issues from global AIDS to preventive diplomacy, to thinking about the world and our country in these events or in these days after September 11th. We're about a month or so after those terrible days. I'm very pleased to have him as a guest for our Living History series. Ambassador Lyman was the United States Ambassador to South Africa in 1992 to 95, a very important period in that country's history with the emergence of Nelson Mandela as president and the democratic transition in the United States, and he in his capacity as ambassador played very important roles in that process. He served for almost 40 years in the Foreign Service, was ambassador to Nigeria, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, and numerous other roles playing making vital contributions to American foreign policy. I've known him in the years since as well as an important contributor to many of the NGOs and to much of the work that's going on now in defining our agenda for the world and as part of the world in the years to come. So Princeton, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
One place we might want to start is thinking back to when you first got involved in international affairs and in the Foreign Service. And reflecting back, what was your own sort of motivation for choosing that career path?
Well, it was something I guess I had decided early on in my life, but when I came to Washington, it was 1961, the beginning of the Kennedy administration. It was very exciting. People felt that anything was possible, that public service was a great thing to do. So that was the atmosphere in which I came, although I have to confess that I also thought that I would do it for a while and then go into academic work, and somehow I stayed for 37 years.
Mm-hmm. What about today? I know the Foreign Service has been having recruitment problems, budget problems as well, limiting their recruitment. But, you know, young people today, I think the paradox that I've noticed is that people are interested in international affairs, but they're choosing the Foreign Service or government less than they are, in many cases, NGOs and other areas. How do you think that the Foreign Service in particular could strengthen its appeal to today's young people?
You're right about the difficulties, and I think they come from several sources. One is that the nature of American ideas of professional careers have changed. The Foreign Service was structured on the basis you come in early on in your career, you stay 40 years, and that's your life. Today, people are more inclined to move around in their careers, and particularly because of spouses' careers. It used to be that your spouse went with you wherever you went, and that was part of the understanding. Today, if one spouse has a career in the United States, they're less likely, particularly after a few years, to want to stay in. One of the things the Foreign Service has to do is to offer more flexible professional opportunities, abilities to come in and out, to bring in people who are prepared to serve for 5, 10 years, but not necessarily forever. That's a different culture than we've had. Second, I think that the service overseas has become difficult because there's been a decline in budgets, decline in support, if you will, about the job, the feeling that this is something valuable and important. I hope that's turning around now with all the new emphasis on our place in the world that comes out of this terrible tragedy. And I must say Colin Powell has done a lot to improve the circumstances for recruitment.
And where was your first foreign posting?
It was in Korea. I went there with the aid mission. I was both the liaison to the embassy and to the U.S. military while I was there, and worked on issues of social development. I was kind of an interloper, a social scientist in the Economic Aid Agency. But it was very exciting because it was at the time that Korea was turning around. And so we were there just as it went from being a basket case in everybody's view to being a very successful country. And that, I learned a lot from that and how they did that.
And then most of the postings over your career were in Africa, is that the case?
In 1971, I changed to the Africa Bureau of AID and became entranced with African affairs and spent much of the rest of my career both in AID and state in Africa. Served in Ethiopia as the aid director in the late 70s, and then was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa for 5 years, and then Ambassador to Nigeria, and as you mentioned, Ambassador to South Africa.
Let's talk a little bit about South Africa. That must have been a very exciting time to be there. It was 1992 to 95. Nelson Mandela was out of jail and the whole transition process started. Could you just reflect on those times and your impressions of them?
The most rewarding experience I had in the Foreign Service. It was when we were getting ready to go, everybody thought the negotiations would be over very quickly and it would move very rapidly. In fact, by the time we got there, negotiations had broken down, there was a resumption of violence, and it took 2 more years before they resolved everything. That gave us the challenge of working very actively on behalf of the process, using all our resources, but not being at the negotiating table. That was the critical point. This was their negotiation. They had made that very clear. So we brought everything to bear on improving the process, helping the process, surrounding it with expertise, with all the resources that we had available. And I think we played a very supportive role, and a very important one. But it was very gratifying to see in the end it come out as well as it did.
If anybody had predicted in, say, 1988 or early 89 that I see 5 or 6 years down the road and I see a South Africa with a President Nelson Mandela coming out of a peaceful, constitutional-based transition, somebody probably would have said, you know, what's wrong with you? What were the key factors that contributed to the success, the historic success of this particular democratic transition?
Well, you're right. And if you look at the literature from the 80s, or even the novels from the 80s, Nadine Gordimer's or others, they all more or less predicted a bloodbath. I think several things were a factor. There's no question that the quality of leadership made a difference. I mean, if there ever was a case where the quality of leadership mattered, it was in South Africa. And that's true of Nelson Mandela, but it's also true of de Klerk, although they came at it from different points of view. Nelson Mandela leading a liberation movement, de Klerk having the good sense to see that his people could not survive in the way they were doing it, and he had to find a different way for them to survive, and having the astuteness to bring it off for whatever reasons. And that's extraordinary combination of leadership. The other thing that struck me, and it came in a very critical time in early 1993, one of the most popular of the liberation people, Chris Hani, was assassinated, probably the second most popular person at the time to Nelson Mandela. The place just was ready to explode. And Mandela, to give an outlet on that, called for mass demonstrations. Everybody thought the place was just going to tear apart. It didn't. There was some violence in Cape Town, and that was about it. And what it brought home to me was, these are not people who want to destroy their country. Other places, people destroy their country. The South Africans wanted this country to be democratic, free, equal, but they didn't want to destroy it. They could have. They could have torn the place apart. They love their country. The third thing is they looked at the abyss. They saw Rwanda. They saw Somalia. And they kept saying to themselves, we don't want to go down that path. We really don't. So they found a way, as one of the negotiators said to me, we found a way that whenever we had a problem, we found a way to solve it. So it was extraordinary leadership, a sense of the people of loving their country, and an ability to continue the process. There was one other critical thing that I would mention, because it has a bearing on other negotiations. In that period of 92 when I first arrived, and the negotiations had broken down, and then there was a lot of violence, and Mandela was adamant that the government could have done more, and that became a very sore point between him and de Klerk. When they resolved it to go back to negotiations in September of 1992, they made an extremely important decision. They would never again allow violence to be a cause for breaking down the negotiations. So violence kept occurring. There were terrible incidents of violence. But they never stopped the negotiations. So they never put the negotiations in the hands of those opposed to them. And I think that's a very important lesson.
That's interesting, because I think some other situations it's been the opposite.
It's been the opposite. People say, until you have peace, you can't. But here, they recognized that even when Mandela suspected de Klerk of at least being complicit, if not responsible, still they kept to the commitment, we're going to negotiate this thing through.
Clearly it took their partnership and many other forces, as you were identifying, in South African society. And within that, Mandela stands out to people as an extraordinary historic figure, truly one of the, these words are often used, but I think it's fair and accurate at this point, one of the great historic figures of the 20th century, someone who spent, nearly 3 decades in prison, yet came out as a man, still with a sense of vision rather than vengeance. And could you talk a little bit about your impressions of him as a man and as a leader?
Well, he has a presence, and he knows it. When he walks in the room, you feel it. He's tall, he's regal. He can joke about himself, but you don't joke about him because you respect him. He's also extremely punctual. If he says he's going to meet you at 7 o'clock, he walks out of that door at 7 sharp. And he also brings a tremendous empathy. And I'll tell you just a story that we had that brought it home. I mentioned that Chris Hani had been assassinated and the tension. We went to, they had 2 ceremonies. One was in Soweto, the Black Township, one was in Johannesburg. We went to the one in Soweto. We were the only diplomats to go. So they took my wife and I and put us down on the stage. It was a very tense moment. It's the only time I saw Mandela almost lose the crowd. So when it was over, everybody was very hyper. And then someone told him I was there. So he came over, he started to talk to me. And he saw my wife standing back. We hadn't met her yet. And he went over and he put his arm around her in the midst of all of that. And she said, I'll love him forever.
That's great.
But he had a feel for people. Now, he was also very human. We did an awful lot back and forth on the tension between him and Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who was his rival in effect. And that became a very violent rivalry between the 2 organizations. So there was a great deal of effort to try to bring them somehow together. And what I discovered is that one of the problems was that they were too much alike. Whenever I went to see Chief Buthelezi, he would always start off by reciting every slight he had ever had from Mandela, every phone call that didn't go answered, etc. And you'd have to go through that. I also found that when I went to Mandela, he did the same thing, same phone calls. And you had to sit there and listen to it to realize these were 2 very proud men. And part of the reason that they couldn't bring themselves together was that pride. But Mandela was always a much bigger person, a person of greater vision. The other thing that I think was striking that just gives a sense of the man was when he had come out of prison and he voiced the same economic policies that the ANC had been voicing for 15, 20 years, the nationalization of the mines and the banks and all the rest. He then went off in 1991 to the meeting in Davos, Switzerland, the World Economic Forum, tore up his speech and gave a speech about free enterprise, liberalized economy, etc. Stunned his advisors. Came back home and he said, look, I went from table to table talking to people and I realized that if we stuck with that kind of ideas, we'd never get a penny of foreign investment in South Africa. Now, the ability of a man to change like that at his age, after 27 years in prison, and say, wait a minute, the world's changing and we've got to change with it. It's just another measure of his capacity.
It's interesting because it's often said that revolutionary leaders aren't as effective at governing. That's one of the critiques of Yeltsin, for example, in Russia, or going back to Castro or Mao, or, you can choose a lot, not necessarily communist leaders. But Mandela seems to have had more success in making that transition. He only served for 1 term by choice, but how effective was he as an actual president?
He turned more and more, as the years went on, of the administration over to Thabo Mbeki as deputy president and the cabinet. He became more the spiritual, broad political leader and didn't immerse himself in a lot of the management day-to-day stuff. It was a good decision. It wasn't his thing. And he had a very, very capable group to do those things. So I think he did the right thing. I think it would have been wrong if he had tried to manage it all. He couldn't have done it. It wasn't his role. And second, the decision he made that you mentioned, I'm only going to serve for one term, he's going to serve forever, was such an important precedent to set in Africa, and to say it's time for another generation to take over. That's as great a contribution as any he made.
Sort of like George Washington. It wasn't part of our Constitution then that you can only serve 2 terms,
That's right.
but it was a consciousness of, of transitions.
Yeah.
So it's been 40 years, really, that you've been involved in international affairs. I'm not going to ask you everything that's happened, but as you reflect today on where we are, and we're talking, a month or so after the terrible events of September 11th, almost stream of consciousness, what are some of the thoughts going through your head as to where we've been, where we are, and where we might be going?
Well, I think one thing I learned in South Africa and saw in retrospect in other situations is where the United States applies itself to really develop people and ideas and puts their resources to work for that in a consistent way, you can have a tremendous influence. We trained a lot of people in South Africa. And I remember when I started work on a book on this period, and I talked to Arthur Chaskelson, who's now president of the Constitutional Court. And I said to him, Arthur, you were there as a constitutional advisor to the ANC during the negotiations. You never seemed to need outside expertise. He said, for 10 years, thanks to the Rockefeller, the Ford, the Carnegie Foundation, we had access to the best brains in the United States. We were ready. We knew what we wanted to do in this negotiation. You multiply that dozens of times, and you see the capacity you have, the Americans have, to develop cadres for governing, for negotiation, for controlling violence, et cetera, because I could multiply that story a dozen times. And it enabled us to play a role of great significance, even though we weren't at the negotiating table. In other cases, we've gone up and down. When I came to Nigeria in 1986, we had started off with a big aid program in the 1960s. Then oil came in the 1970s. We canceled all the programs. And a whole generation of Nigerians had grown up with very little contact with the United States, very little openness to ideas of how you bring about democracy in a military situation, a frustrated negative intelligentsia. And now that there's an opening again in Nigeria, we're back with a $100 million aid program, but that's starting and stopping. Loses you great opportunities. Now, the ability to have that consistency and to know where and how much resources you're going to apply is a difficult set of decisions. But I think that's areas in which we can have a tremendous impact. And we had the flexibility of different kinds of resources, AID, USIA, et cetera, that makes a difference. The third thing is that I think that what we've probably learned again out of the terrible events of September is that we really do need the cooperation of the rest of the world. We go through these periods where we think we don't need them because, we're so powerful, et cetera. But we really do, whether it's in trade, whether it's in control of international crime, or whether now it's the control of international terrorism. These are issues that national power alone doesn't enable you to address. And therefore you need partners. And to have partners, you have to build coalitions and you have to build partnerships. And that takes time. And that takes a lot of interchange and effort and a lot of mutuality. You have to deal with their interests as well as yours. We've gone in and out of that feeling. We dropped it after the Cold War. I think we're going to come back to it now. And I think if we give our attention to it, it will be very helpful.
Why do you think we have so much trouble with this consistency? What you described is you invest, it's like any investment, you invest before you need the resources, right? If you're planning retirement, you invest at 62. So we invested in South Africa for many years, and we didn't know when the point was coming where we would need basically, or South Africa would need those resources, but it came. We tend not to do that, I guess is what you're saying in my own experience. I'm sure you've tried many times to get us to do that. Why do you think we don't, and how can we maybe try to make the case to do better in the future?
Well, I think it goes to what your sense is of our role in the world and how you define it. We did it a lot in the Cold War because we had that frame and we justified it. And I'll be honest, in the Africa Bureau, I tried to put a Cold War frame on everything just to get resources. And, you know, it wasn't really the right thing to do in some ways. But that was the frame in which you could get resources for Africa and for a variety of programs. It's not the best frame. And it wouldn't be good if everything we do now is just in terms of terrorism. But you've got to have some framework that says this is why we're doing it and why we're doing it for a long term. And that means having a vision of the kind of world you want to build. John Eikenberry, who you may know, has written about, he's got a new book out on the development of international institutions. And he points out that one of the brilliant things we did after World War II was to create this tremendous array of international institutions around which we could develop coalitions, partnerships, etc., restore financial stability to the world, deal with problems of poverty, deal with these issues, etc., and that we used those to amplify our interests in a variety of different ways. Now, the Cold War provided some of the framework for that, but there was also vision there. People had come out of the First World War, realized we hadn't done that after World War I, etc. We need now to create that kind of vision, of a sense of, look, we're part of this world. We learned that in a terrible way. We've got to have a vision of where we want to get in the world, and clear goals. You can't eliminate poverty from the world, but you can cut it back tremendously in 10, 15 years if you do it in a sustained way. And there are a number of other things one can do. Sets the goals, they're clear, people think they're doable, and you set the resources to do them.
A lot of the work I know you're doing now with the Aspen Institute is very much directed at this, and the sense I get from our conversations is that, you know, you're somewhat optimistic, realistic but optimistic, that it's not the case that, you know, this is all anathema to the American public. Could you talk a little bit about your own senses of where the public's coming from and what the paths ahead might be?
I think what we've found at the Aspen Institute in our project, through a lot of research and focus groups and analysis of polls, etc., is that Americans see the United States playing an active role in the world. They are not isolationists, and they haven't been. This goes back several decades. They do bring to it a sense of values, that we ought to be doing what's right, and they also bring a very strong sense of shared responsibility. We shouldn't be doing more than what our share is. And part of the problem we have is that the sense of our share is greatly exaggerated, that we're doing much more than we do, and that's a product of the media and the way we talk about our role. But what it offers is for a leader, the president, the Congress, to come to the American public and say, yeah, we can play this role, and it will be right. It will do the right things, and it will be reasonable. We'll be doing it in cooperation with others, and it will make for a better world. And you lay it out in ways, and I think the American people will respond. We've seen frequently in foreign policy that when we don't have a value structure to what we're doing abroad, you start to lose the American public. You know, when President Clinton went into Kosovo, he tried 3 different rationales. He tried sanctity of NATO, didn't go over with the public. He tried stability in Europe. It didn't go over with the American public. He then went to saving people's lives and protecting the refugees, and he got a 60% approval rate. Because Americans want to have what they do. They know it's obviously in our interest, but they want to have that justification, that we're doing the right thing. And that's a tremendously powerful force for good if we use it.
What do you say to those who would agree with that, but then raise the question, as at least they would phrase it, of consistency? You know, we only care now because it affected us, and when we get a sense that it may not affect us anymore, we'll just sort of fade away. Or, you know, we say we're for values here, but not over there. I'm sure you've had to answer that argument a lot as a diplomat, and both as a diplomat and your own thinking. Well, how do you respond to that? Well,
Americans are not saints. They're not just altruists. They're generous. They feel that we're a generous country, and Americans are generous personally. They will contribute to every major disaster or calamity. but they don't want to be the person who does it all, or the nation that does it all. So I think that the consistency is in terms of whether whatever it is we're doing abroad is defined in terms that the public understands. If one simply defines it negatively, this foreign aid is a waste of money because it isn't working. Well, if it isn't working, Americans don't like it. They support foreign aid, but they tend to think there are a lot of problems, it doesn't work. If you say, look, this program isn't perfect, but here's what it's doing for children, here's what it's doing for poverty, etc. Americans can sustain that. They sustained all these coalitions throughout the Cold War for a magnificent Marshall Plan program. Here is where the leadership counts. If the leadership assumes the public is not going to be supportive, then the public won't be supportive because it will never be brought to the public as a way of mobilizing that support. If the leaders say, you know, I believe in this and I believe in going out and getting the American public support, I think it's possible. So we have a problem as much with the leadership because the leadership gets distracted. It gets distracted by domestic needs and, you know, individual programs at home and partisan politics, etc. And the leadership doesn't often have a vision that goes beyond 2 years, let alone 4 or 8. So you need statesmen. You need, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, you need a general marshal, you need a Dean Acheson, you need people who can see 10 years ahead and define that to the American public.
I was actually going to ask you, from your experience with secretaries of state, both in your service or on your own reflection of the post-World War II period, who were some of the really great secretaries of state, and what do you think was the keys to their success?
Well, I wasn't there when Dean Acheson was there, but obviously he helped shape the post-Cold War world in the middle of a great deal of controversy. And had a vision of where we wanted to go and what kind of alliances had to be built, etc. And Marshall had this sense. In my own working experience, I found George Shultz to be a very effective Secretary of State, who during a very difficult crisis in the Reagan presidency grabbed the leadership mantle and led those last 2 years of the Reagan administration to very momentous agreements that led to the end of the Cold War. He also had a way of delegating in a way that other secretaries often didn't do. I worked with Chet Crocker, who was then Assistant Secretary for Africa. George Shultz didn't spend a lot of his time on Africa. But he made it clear that Chet Crocker spoke for the United States and had his backing. That gave Chet Crocker power. Otherwise, he hadn't. I've seen other secretaries of state who won't do that, who won't give the assistant secretaries that kind of thing, which means that unless they're focused on the problem, it doesn't get enough attention. I have a lot of respect for James Baker, but that's one of his faults, I think. I'm not willing to say, this is your program, you run with it, but you have my backing. You're going to speak for me. It wasn't his style. And so he focused heavily on 2 or 3 areas, and others did or didn't get done. Although Larry Eberger filled in behind that extraordinarily well. Warren Christopher I found to be a very decent man, one of the most decent people I have known, and a man who knew that he was not popular, he was not getting a good shake in the press, and decided that it wasn't going to change him because he wasn't going to change. He would do what he felt was important. He too focused on only a few areas. He never came to South Africa in the time I was there. He didn't even come to the inauguration of Nelson Mandela, which Mandela felt very keenly. But Christopher's view was, that's going okay, and I'm going to do my thing, and I don't care what people criticize me for. But he was a very decent man. He really cared. So I came away with a lot of respect for him. Madeleine Albright was a tremendously active Secretary of State. And she came in with a lot of publicity and therefore a lot of the difficulty, if I can be candid about it, was that she tended to aggregate an awful lot of responsibility to herself. It flowed up. She was on the phone negotiating the details of UN resolutions or this communique or that. And when you do that, then the negotiations all flow to that direction. What foreign leader is going to deal with so-and-so when they know the secretary is going to call the foreign minister and go over the same item? And that frustrated her too. She said, how come everything comes to my desk? Well, partly it came to her desk because that's where she operated. But it was part of her personality, her sense of activism and personalizing her relationships with people. I think she did a lot of good things. She was very sensitive to the new issues, the global issues, the new security issues. She had a retreat where all of us came together, and she said to the assistant secretaries who do the very traditional bilateral relationships, you've got to get into global warming. You've got to get into population. These are the new issues. And bureaucratically, that was very difficult to do. But she gave a lot of support to those. She understood those issues very well.
Let me also ask you about the United Nations as an institution and its role. They've just, again, last week, been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize and, as an institution, and with particular recognition for Secretary General Kofi Annan. The UN has had a lot of ups and downs, particularly as perceived by the United States. They won the Nobel Peace Prize, at least the peacekeeping forces did in the late 80s, for their role in the Iran-Iraq War, and indeed in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And then we had the early 90s where they came, rightly or wrongly, to in some ways personify, as perceived in this country, everything that was wrong with peacekeeping. They've now, I think, are seen more positively. I worry sometimes that that can lead to sort of, in some ways, an overreaching. And, you know, how would you define the role that the UN should be playing based upon where it's been successful and where it hasn't in the past?
Yeah. I think the painful lesson we learned in the 90s, and there's an awful lot of complex aspects to what happened in Somalia, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, etc., was that we tended, we the US and other countries, to abdicate to the UN things we didn't want to do, but without the resources to do them. So we put in minimal forces into Yugoslavia, for example, to guard humanitarian activities and safe havens. But what we hadn't realized was something terrible that happened in the 90s. It used to be that the symbol of international presence had a power. You didn't have to put in a huge force. You put in those UN people with those blue hats, people wouldn't cross the line. What we've learned in the 1990s is that no longer exists. People will kill UN soldiers. They'll shoot them down, they'll run right over them. And suddenly, symbolism no longer worked. But we hadn't reached that point to say, well, if symbolism doesn't work, what kind of a force do you need to deal with the Yugoslavia? So then we realized that what you needed was a fighting force, a NATO, or a coalition of the willing, like in East Timor, etc. But in the meanwhile, the UN took the beating for its failures. Now, the UN is a complex institution that often is its own worst enemy. Where I think Kofi Annan deserves a great deal of credit is that he has improved the operation of the UN tremendously. He's also been willing to take on some of the shibboleths in the UN. He has pushed human rights very hard. He has challenged the sanctity of sovereignty in the face of humanitarian disasters. And he has been willing to take on in the Middle East the tremendously long unfair treatment of Israel in the UN, which makes him probably the first Secretary General in decades who can go to Israel and talk to the Israeli government with any kind of authority. Those are very important things he's done to improve the image, the operation of the UN. What has happened most recently is when the United States soured on the UN and took out an awful lot of bile on it, and all our dues arrears built up, and the relationship was terrible and it was so hard to negotiate during those years, was we suddenly again found that we needed them, and that was Kosovo. Because after we did the intervention in Kosovo, we suddenly needed somebody to take over and run the post-war thing. And after telling the UN we didn't want them to do any more nation building, We went to them and said, we want you to take on this unbelievable task in Kosovo, which meant that we could not say no to them doing it in East Timor, nor to taking on a very difficult assignment in Sierra Leone. So suddenly we found ourselves back in supporting the UN. In some very good cases, I think East Timor will ultimately be a success, Kosovo perhaps. Sierra Leone is chancy, Congo is very chancy. So I don't think we've resolved the question of how the UN can do these things, but I think we've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work. And the UN has learned. Where the UN is not capable, in my view, and this is a hard lesson for the UN, is economic policy and governing global economics. Something the General Assembly would love and ECOSOC would love to do, and they're simply incapable of doing it. And what they can do, however, is be a very important debating source on the morality and equity issues, but not to try and run them.
You raised the sovereignty point, which is such a fundamental issue, and I think that Kofi Annan was very, forthright and outspoken on this issue, and probably will take it up again now that he's been reelected to his second term. But in some ways, so many issues come down to this, in the sense of, the sense of sovereignty as the rights of states, or is it the responsibility of states? And there's a debate about what the UN Charter, quote unquote, really means on this issue. What's your sense of, how to strike the right balance on this question of, how sacrosanct is sovereignty?
I think that Kofi Annan has done a great service, because it used to be that we only had one solution for the kind of ethnic conflict that we've been seeing in a number of places, and that was self-determination. You have to get this entity to be independent, etc. We're now discovering that that's not viable in very many more cases. It is more disruptive in some cases than it is settling. And Boutros-Ghali came to the point where he called ethnic conflict a disease. Then what's your alternative? Your only alternative then is to urge for pluralistic democratic societies. That's the alternative then for ethnic conflict. And by laying that out there, it sets a different direction for the international community. No longer is a solution in every case self-determination and independence. And then Kofi Annan says, sovereignty, as you said, is a responsibility as well as a right. And if you don't exercise your responsibility, then the international community has a right. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate into military intervention, but it can translate into sanctions, other kinds of pressure, isolation, etc., to say, look, as long as you cause these problems by the way you're doing it, the international community has the right to take some kind of action, saying sovereignty isn't totally pure in that sense. I think it's important. It leaves open how you react to these situations. But I think without that, we would be constantly back and forth between the sovereignty on the one hand, and then when a crisis becomes as great as it did in Yugoslavia, say, well, we just have to roll over it.
Right. So in some ways, what you're arguing is that there's actually more middle ground for ways in which the international community can get involved that don't necessarily lead to military intervention. But if you don't do that, in the end, you may need the more extreme measures. But
That's right.
I asked you before about secretaries of state. What about other international leaders that you've encountered or observed over the scope of your career? Who stands out in your mind as in that category of great figures of the last 30, 40 years, other than from our own country?
I think, one of the things that's striking about this current period, although it may change now, and I think it is changing now, is that we went through a period where there were no great leaders on the scene. I mean, when Nelson Mandela emerged in the 90s, we used to sit around and say, is there anybody on the world scene that commands the same stature as he does? And frankly, they didn't. Kohl had lost that. He was not Adenauer. Chirac wasn't that way. Russia was in turmoil, etc. We went through a period where we didn't have the great figures. we may be coming back a little bit. Tony Blair is a very impressive figure, and he's on the world stage in a major way. George Bush is growing unbelievably fast as a significant leader. I think Putin is an extraordinarily shrewd leader. I wouldn't call him great necessarily, but shrewd. But I think we went through a period where we didn't have a lot of really great leaders. Maybe it was the times, etc. But it's hard to think of, in that period.
In Africa, a lot of the leaders of the decolonization movement, of course, ended up, staying in power and sort of losing their mantle, as it were. But within an African context, are there other, leaders that you think, even relative terms, stand out?
I think Julius Nyerere, even though his economic policies were probably disastrous, really has to be ranked as a great leader. He did a great deal for Tanzania. He brought the literacy rates up very high. The country has always been at peace. He did finally step down when it became obvious that you needed multi-party politics. And afterwards, he was very candid about his own shortcomings. I've listened to a couple of his speeches afterwards on human rights and other things where he said, I didn't do this right. And that's not many people will do that. So I would rank him there. I would rank Diouf as a guy who probably stayed too long, but when he finally was voted out of office, just left, and now can act if he wishes as a senior statesman. Too many of the African leaders, and Masere from Botswana, too many of them couldn't resist getting back involved in a negative way. And Kenneth Kaunda, who I knew very well because he would come over to South Africa a great deal and we would always get together. And I urged him to stay out of politics in Zambia and become one of the elder statesmen. He couldn't resist. He had to go back in. I don't think it served him well. So you didn't have many African leaders serving this role. Obasanjo served that role for a long time. Now he's back as a president. So you had a handful of people who, from Botswana, from Senegal, from Nigeria, as far as Obasanjo was concerned, and Traore now of Mali has become a kind of a roving statesman, someone who turned his country over to democracy, etc. I think these people can be very important if they would play this role and not play around with getting back into domestic politics.
So we've got about a minute left, and as I think about my students today, if a student was here and asked you why they should choose a career in international affairs, what would your advice be to them?
I'd say it has lots of frustrations, but there is hardly a career that I think is more exciting. I can't think of but one assignment in Washington in 37 years that I didn't find rewarding, exciting, stimulating, and one that I grew in. And I think that is something where you feel like you could do something useful, where you're engaged in a way where you're often given a lot of more initiative than people think. And I think the best embassies are the ones that take initiatives, the ones who say to Washington, this is the way we're going to go, not waiting for Washington to tell them. And that gives you a tremendous opportunity, and that's exciting, and so that's what I would tell your students.
Well, thank you very much.
My
Appreciate
pleasure.
it. It's been great.
Thanks. Thank you.
Good.